What's going on, guys? So I wanted to gauge everybody's mindset when it comes to game collecting, or really just what's your criteria for deciding between which games to get on which platforms or which games you're renting versus buying. You know, I'm a physical collection type of guy. I buy just about every single game I have an interest in playing physically and for consoles at least. And that's regardless of whether I'm a fan of that game or sort of going in blind. If there is a physical edition, I will always choose to buy it over a digital copy any day of the week. And that's even, if I have to wait for a physical version to be released, if it takes a month or even a year later, I'm willing to do that. Again, that's in terms of console releases. Since I am primarily still a console gamer, that means I actually have the luxury of having the option for physical pickups for just about the majority of game releases out there. However, as I've hinted at many times before, I do plan to eventually go back to PC gaming, at which point I will no longer be buying most of my games physically when it comes to those releases. But, as I built out a few of my console collections, I realized that as I'm getting older, the prospect of buying everything I want physically and then keeping those games around isn't really the most sensible choice. And there are actually a ton of games of which I own multiple different copies of. In fact, I would estimate a good 60% of my console collection I also have duplicate versions of for PC. And unlike consoles where it's basically the same game experience regardless of how much time passes, give or take, sometimes you do have backwards compatibility which can help smoothen out frame rates or just increase resolution limits. And in actually very rare circumstances, you will have developers actually patch games with increased graphical detail on top of that. But one of the more enticing things about PC is that you can go back to those games you played before, but now having the advantage of new hardware gives you the ability to push frame rates to just ludicrous amounts while increasing graphical detail at the same time. Or even if something as simple as like a resolution change or an aspect ratio, difference can basically yield an almost completely different gameplay experience to what you had when you originally played it. And that's not even talking about mods or graphical tweaks, which can really breathe new life into a game or just fix long-standing issues. But I digress. Let me first start by going over my criteria for game collecting. Then I'm going to talk a bit about my thoughts as to why I do these things, what excites me about doing it originally, and sort of where my mindset is right now. So what I do is I create a playlist of games released in any given year, and that more or less dictates exactly what I will be playing and the order of which I will be playing those games as well. Now, I shared this on Twitter, but I don't think I really made an announcement here on YouTube, but I have actually resumed playing modern release titles. I took a 2-year break from playing any games released during this generation, and actually the last game I played was Mortal Kombat 1 in 2023. So that means that literally all the games released after Mortal Kombat 1 I have yet to touch at this time. And, in the meantime, what I was doing was really kind of focusing on making huge strides in playing through my Gen 7 collection. Right now I have a total of roughly 200 games across PS3 and Xbox 360, with a few dozen more I do plan to play on the PC platform. And I currently am at the early 2010 releases, meaning that I played every single game I was interested in playing from that era, starting from the end of 2005, which was the launch of the Xbox 360, working my way through to the inevitable end of that generation in late 2013. So I'm more than halfway done at this point. But when I was collecting for that generation early on, there was this conscious decision that I made. And if I recall correctly, I even gauged many of your own personal takes, as I remember making a video asking you guys whether I should sell what's currently in my collection or keep it for prosperity. And many people had good opinions going in either direction of that decision. But ultimately what I decided to do was keep my collection, and then I turned it into basically going back and actually picking up games that I always wanted to play from that era, but just, didn't get a chance to that time around. And then ultimately, when it came to me completing my collection, when I started playing through those games, I in turn, made these reminiscing videos, which allowed me to kind of re-review the games and talk about my thoughts and feelings on them for both games I haven't played yet and games that I was replaying all these years later. So my criteria back then for collecting those games was quite simple. What was I interested in? What did I want to play? And where would I have played it if I was there on release? Now, early on when I was collecting for that era, which was really the first time I was really getting into game collecting, I was starting from that era, right? I was picking up games that I had honestly little to no interest in, and I was just getting them because the value was high or they were cult classics and popular games that a lot of people liked. But as I got older and started spending more money on these types of games, I was just realizing that it made little to no sense because, at the end of the day, I was building a game collection for me. And I often think that early on, I felt I had to get certain games because I wanted to have this sort of impressive looking library and collection on YouTube. And I didn't want anyone thinking, watching those videos that I was, like leaving out these great games or that I had like really poor taste. And it's just one of those things, where I tell people today who are interested in getting into game collecting that first and foremost, you should be making a collection for yourself. That if it's for any other reason, then here are the games that I want to play and here are the games I want to, go back to, then you're doing it for the wrong reasons. It has to start with your interest and your love for getting into it. And it can't just be because, you want to make this crazy collection or compilation on YouTube. If you're doing it for that reason, it's for the wrong reason. Get the games you want to play for the platform you want to play it on. Don't worry about any other factors because it's not about what other people think. It's certainly not about who has the most amount of plastic cases or shelves at the core of game collecting. The only thing that should matter to you is you wanting to go back and play those games, wanting to revisit that era or that childhood memory of yours, and not having, experienced something you really wanted to back then, or even re-experiencing something that is just truly important. So I always tell people it needs to start with that foundation. If you're getting into game collecting or just want to become another game collector on YouTube who all they show is how many games they play but don't really have the time to play through them, listen, you're not a museum. All you're doing is basically gatekeeping those perfectly playable experiences from other players who just want to play those games and enjoy and have a good time. And they're going to get far more use out of that game than you ever will. So this for me is a really important distinction. And it's why I really champion these reminiscing videos, because it's foundational evidence that I'm actually going back to play these games, that these are not just games that I'm picking up and playing and putting them on a shelf because, I'll get to it eventually, or isn't it great, look at my really fancy large collection. These are games I actually have a real interest in and actually want to play, and it should start with that at the heart of it, at the core of it. It's not about gatekeeping these games or keeping things preserved for you, yourself, and I. It should be about wanting to revisit those memories and celebrating that era, and really wanting those experiences to be preserved for you and the people that you care about and the ones that you want to share those memories with. But certainly, something that's been coming up is that I see myself, after I basically go through my entire collection, taking a hard look at all the games I acquired and then asking myself, all right, which games should I keep forever? Which do I feel I can part with? Especially, when I said earlier that I have many of these games on Steam and other platforms, it would only make sense for me to kind of, downscale things to basically what's only necessary, or which games I just have an emotional affinity towards. But I'll touch upon that in a separate video regarding what we should do after we play through our collections, because it's also an important topic that I can get into very heavily. But for those of you who watch my yearly updates and goal vlogs, you know that this year in particular has been the year of excess. And a lot of that has brought into question my game collecting and certainly my affinity for consoles and stuff like that. One of the objectives that I've had this year was to purge myself of just all this ridiculous stuff for the sake of just having, stuff around. And that's why I was sort of in the process of getting rid of a lot of my old consoles, of which I have 2 or 3 additional models of, for no reason in particular, other than to say, hey, this is mine. I have all these different variations of the platform. In reality, when a lot of those consoles, just break over time. You can call it what you will, but I think a lot of people will say hardware will fail and that all they're doing is protecting their investment. And believe me, I sort of dealt with this firsthand. I know what it's like to see these consoles die, and then having a backup platform to just continue your games makes a huge difference. But I also know that equally taking care of your stuff is just as important. And for myself, I'm not personally driving these machines extremely hard. It's not like I'm only playing games on these consoles 24/7. I game across multiple different devices, and these consoles aren't even hooked up, for long periods of time, with power kind of surging through them. So I'm not driving these machines, day in and day out. And I got a brand new PS5 Pro at launch, right? And it went weeks without being used and was occasionally turned on to check on system updates, play demos, or watch movies during my 2-year break of modern titles. So literally almost a year after that console released, I am now just only starting to use it to play those games that I had wanted to get to and just basically took a break from. And yeah, it's a slow grind, but I also have my time split. So having backwards compatibility be a big thing that seems to be staying in the future as well is just fantastic, because it means that these games and this hardware won't be so necessary as time moves forward. In any case, here's my big question for you guys regarding this topic. If you are into game collecting, what are your conditions for the games that you pick up? Do you only pick up games that you're interested in? Do you actually take a chance to pick up some random unknown titles here or there? And even more importantly, for those of you who have picked up many games through your collection, are you making a conscious effort to actually play through them? Really, I believe playing through your collection is just as important as deciding whether or not to start game collecting in the first place. And if gamer scores or trophy levels are good for anything, you can at least gauge what people are playing and for how long they play it for. But yeah, curious to see what you guys think regarding this, and hope you all have a fantastic day. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.